What if everything we know about the prehistoric world was a lie? What if bones were used not to explain the past, but to rewrite it? It seems all of this was meticulously crafted not to inform, but to estrange us from our true origin. A tapestry woven with intent to redirect the meaning of existence toward a singular message, to diminish, to distort, and to eternally anchor the human soul in the illusion of insignificance. Long before the world was captivated by giant replicas in museums and colossal creatures in films, there was a single discovery: a tooth. It was no larger than a grown man's thumb. It was embedded in a rocky formation in England, in the Sussex region. The year was 1822, and the man who found it was named Gideon Mantell, a rural physician with a deep interest in geology and an ambition that reached beyond the limits of his profession. Although the first dinosaur officially described in scientific terms was Megalosaurus in 1824 by William Buckland, it was this modest tooth found by Mantell that gave rise to the collective imagination of the extinct giant reptile. The iguanodon was not the first in name, but it was the first to capture the world's attention and feed the cultural construction of the dinosaur myth. Mantell, intrigued by the fragment, had no clear idea what he had found. But something in the atmosphere of the time, an emerging cultural drive to uncover the ancient, was pushing toward the reconstruction of a grand past to support the new post-Enlightenment scientific narrative. He took it home and examined it for days, eventually proposing that the tooth belonged to an unknown animal. A reptile, but not just any. A gigantic, extinct, prehistoric one. Nos confunden. He had nothing more than that tooth, and later a few indistinct bone fragments. Yet, through a strange alchemy of hypothesis, art, and imagination, the iguanodon was born. The name was chosen based on the shape of the tooth, which vaguely resembled that of an iguana, and so began a cascade of speculative reconstructions. But behind that romantic narrative lay something deeper, an institutional need. In the early 19th century, the major European academies, especially those in Britain and France, were locked in a race to define the Earth's history. Scripture was being challenged by new chronologies. That newly imagined deep time, a time without humans, needed to be populated with creatures. And if the Earth was millions of years old, as some geologists claimed, then there must have been a previous world, radically different. It was then that Richard Owen emerged, the true architect of the myth. In 1842, without massive excavations or complete skeletons, he coined the term Dinosauria, a name that combined the Greek words dinos, terrible, and sauros, lizard. Owen understood something few did in his time. Evidence wasn't as important as narrative. A story that could inspire, astonish, and at the same time definitively separate modern man from ancient tales of giants, biblical beasts, and cycles of creation. The first bones, scattered and out of context, were shaped with plaster, wire, and a great deal of speculation. Painters and sculptors began building entire images from isolated vertebrae. Imagination overtook discovery. An elephant femur could be reinterpreted as dinosaur bone, a deformed jaw as that of an extinct predator. Nos confunden. Everything fit, because nothing really had to fit. There was no scientific public ready to question those assemblies, and the few who did were quickly marginalized. Why go to such lengths to build this narrative? Because dinosaurs served a purpose: to consolidate the new Darwinian paradigm, to displace humanity from the center of creation, and to affirm that all life is the result of chance, deep time, and inevitable extinction. A powerful message. If the largest creatures ever to walk the earth were wiped out by a mere asteroid, then what meaning does human existence really have? The Victorian scientific elite needed that message. It laid the foundation to displace creation myths, indigenous worldviews, and ideas of a purposeful world. With the dinosaurs, a new narrative was established: that Earth has always been and will always be a place of chaos, extinction, and survival of the fittest. Nos confunden. Museums began filling with skeletons, but little was said about how they were composed. Mostly reconstructions from incomplete pieces, often replicated in plaster based on artistic assumptions. The paleontological industry was beginning to rise, and with it, a new way to shape the human mind from childhood. For decades, the idea of dinosaurs remained a blend of speculative science and educational spectacle. Museum displays, academic lectures, and school textbooks repeated the story endlessly: a world inhabited by reptilian giants that suddenly vanished. But something was missing: a reason, an ending, a climax. That climax arrived in 1980, when Luis Alvarez, a physicist turned geologist, and his son Walter proposed a theory that would capture the imagination of the entire world. The dinosaurs were annihilated by an asteroid that struck the Earth 66 million years ago. The evidence: a thin layer of iridium, a rare element in Earth's crust, but supposedly common in what they call meteorites. Those miraculous rocks that, according to the official tale, travel across infinite galaxies just to crash here. Or perhaps more likely, are deliberately released by those above as part of a well-orchestrated narrative, found in geological sediments scattered across various parts of the world. Nos confunden. It was the perfect spark. Without the need for direct fossil proof, without reconstructing the final days of these imaginary creatures, the story was accepted without resistance. How could one doubt such a colossal cinematic event? An object from the sky, a planet-wide cataclysm, a nuclear winter. It sounded like a modern prophecy, and it was. Because this theory, beyond its scientific packaging, served as an emotional pillar of the narrative. It implanted a powerful idea: that life can disappear in an instant, without warning, from external causes. It was the birth of a fear mindset spread across all of humanity. But let's examine the details. No fresh crater remains or direct burn layers have been found associated with dinosaur fossil beds. There are no complete fossilized skeletons frozen in the precise moment of the alleged impact. All are reconstructions, assemblies, isolated bones scattered in rock formations without accurate dating. Nos confunden. The famous Chicxulub crater in Yucatan, Mexico, was identified years after the asteroid theory had already been accepted by the scientific community as a visual necessity to justify the story. All of this was supported by a colossal media machine. Films like Jurassic Park, BBC documentaries, illustrated school books. The story became cultural doctrine, not verifiable science, and most importantly, it became a tool for emotional control. If the largest, strongest, and most adapted beings disappeared without defense against a rock from the sky, how could humans resist their own fate? This idea, implanted from childhood, generates an internalized notion of vulnerability, of insignificance. It's the same emotion used when talking about climate change, human extinction, or the threat from above. It all has a psychological root in the dinosaur asteroid. And it is no coincidence. Academic institutions, funded by geopolitical interests, understood that narrating the past also shapes the present. To implant the image of a wild, purposeless, chaotic planet in constant danger was essential to displace the spiritual notion of the human being as a guardian, a creator, or a transcendent soul. Thus, the extinction of the dinosaurs became a model story, easy to understand, impactful, and above all, useful. A story with no witnesses. A story that leaves no room for questioning. A story that, deep down, says more about the future of humankind than the past of giant reptiles. Nos confunden. The official story of the dinosaurs was not born to answer questions, but to generate new, controlled ones. From its very genesis, with loose teeth interpreted as giant reptiles, to the apocalyptic asteroid narrative, it was all constructed with near-surgical precision. But for what purpose? To divert, to conceal, to replace. The invention of dinosaurs was not a scientific mistake, it was a cultural design. In the mid-19th century, as colonial empires expanded their dominance, they also expanded over the worldviews of the peoples they conquered. And what did they bring with them? New maps, new chronologies, and a completely reinvented history of the Earth. Prehistory was an invention, not merely as a chronological concept, but as a carefully crafted narrative structure, a tale designed to fill the void of the unknown with controlled speculation. And history too was an invention, a selective memory, sculpted by empires, rewritten by victors, and weaponized to erase what could not be explained or what was not convenient to remember. Entire civilizations were silenced, sacred knowledge rebranded as myth, ancient wisdom recast as superstition. Before fire, before language, before anything, giant reptiles supposedly ruled the earth. A world without humans, a time without soul, a past where consciousness did not exist, a narrative that conveniently removed humanity from the origin story. That disconnected the modern being from his ancestral memory. That erased the sacred and replaced it with the savage. And thus, the idea was sown that the human being is merely the last link in a chaotic chain, born by accident, without purpose, without any connection to the divine. Nos confunden. The elite behind this narrative knew exactly what they were doing. They needed to erase ancient accounts, stories of titans, giants, celestial wars, and sacred creations. Replace universal legends, ones that shared deep similarities across cultures separated by oceans, with a uniform, unquestionable scientific version. Justify evolution as the sole doctrine to supplant the idea that the human being was a special creation, bearer of something beyond mere genetics. Dinosaurs functioned as the perfect hinge, astonishing enough to replace the dragons of myth, scientific enough to be accepted by academia, and so distant in time that no one could verify them. Furthermore, this narrative opened the doors to entire industries, museums, funded excavations, scientific publications, educational products, movies, tourism, and even modern Darwinist religions. The lie was not only accepted, it was monetized. And while the world debated how many horns a Triceratops had, or whether the T-Rex was a scavenger, no one looked toward the real mysteries. The impossible megalithic structures. The civilizations erased from history. The real giants, whose footprints, skeletons, and stories were systematically hidden or destroyed. Dinosaurs took the place once occupied by ancestral memory, and by filling that space with plastic creatures fabricated in the laboratories of history, they severed the invisible thread that connected humanity to its true origin. Today, the idea of questioning this narrative feels like heresy. Who would dare doubt something that appears in children's books, in the world's most prestigious museums, and in scientific laboratories? But truth does not fear questions. Lies, on the other hand, protect themselves with ridicule, censorship, and spectacle. And if this lie could endure for 2 centuries, if we can confirm that a grand deception existed here, then the real question becomes, what else have we been lied to about?
YouTube channel Nos Confunden.